And during that time he was in prison, he wrote a book, Mein Kampf. More than 700 pages, in which he told the world what he planned to do, and we wish we had paid more attention. I did look at the book one time. There's an English translation of the book, and you get a man who says one thing in one chapter, turns around and says another thing in another chapter, a man who seems to be somewhat moody. Nevertheless, he at least, you can't accuse him of not telling the world what he thought. Within a few months, he was out of prison, but the temporary depression, sometimes called the Forgotten Depression, was over. And Hitler was a man who simply could not function very well in good times. Germany was prospering, the world was prospering, or it seemed to be, and these were lean years for Adolf Hitler. Lean years, his party's numbers went down and down and down. Lean years until the Depression hit. The Wall Street in New York City, Wall Street and stock market crashed in October 1929, and in short order, German money became utterly worthless. The Germans tried to solve the problem of printing up more paper until it took a whole wheelbarrow full of German marks to buy a loaf of bread. Basically, the dollar became worth less than a penny, speaking American terms. The $10 bill eventually became worth less than a penny. Then the $100 bill became worth less than a penny. I'm speaking in American terms, literally. German currency was not even worth the paper it was printed on. But eventually the Germans found a way to solve the problem. If you go into detail, they started trading shares of stock instead of money. And they'd go to the store and find that the storekeepers were accepting the shares. So they began trading in shares, and eventually they were able to get some kind of means of trade going again, and eventually the value of the mark went back up. But during this time of depression, Hitler was able to get in front of the crowds and sway the crowds and convince them that he, Adolf Hitler, had the solution. Now, again, Adolf Hitler was a very persuasive talker to people who were starving, who had no hope for the future. He promised them hope. He promised them that they were going places, and he began to fill them with some, what the history book I had in high school called strange beliefs. He told them that they, the German people, were the master race, the Aryans. They were these supermen. Now, folks, have you ever read a Superman comic book? There are persons who believe the idea came from Nietzsche, who talked about the Superman. Nietzsche told the German people that you are the Supermen of the future, and it's up to you to create a race of people where all the men look like Greek gods. Folks, this is an ideal that's impossible. And all the women are extremely beautiful and have perfect figures, a perfect race. Blue-eyed blonde was the ideal of perfection, of superiority. Again, to create a race where everybody is blue-eyed blonde and all the men are muscular he-men and all the women are beautiful. Again, this is an impossibility to create, but apparently Adolf Hitler did not know that. Now, Hitler had the, like I say, public address systems installed when he gave a speech, and that way he could talk to 1,000 people. And when he talked, he could put some of our enthusiastic preachers to shame. I mean, he was loud. He put his whole body into it. And Americans would listen. Oh yes, Americans get a speech by means of shortwave radio. Most of you probably do not know what shortwave radio is, but shortwaves are means of radio communication where you can get a small amount of power to go across the ocean when the skip is on. Now, is there anybody who knows what I'm talking about? One of you, okay. Basically, nobody hardly does. Well, until 30 years ago, most of the world's listening was done by shortwave. But Americans could listen to him by means of shortwave radio. And they might not understand his language, but they could tell that here was a man who had a lot of insecurity in him. In fact, it was believed that Hitler might have been shell-shocked in World War I. And a man who was trying to make up for his feeling of inferiority by putting on an air of superiority. And again, the Germans, though, did not see him that way. All right. I'm going to pause here and call roll. Okay. This is 326. All right. Men, I'm going to call the names of the persons who are here. Men, Gage. Evan, Lillian, Jessica, Zolma, Soo-young, Jonathan, whose name did I not call? Cynthia. All right, okay. Cynthia, okay. That'll take care of that. The ones whose name I didn't call, well, I call everybody's name who's here. All right. Now, Hitler's party, the Nazi Party, became the most powerful party in Germany. However, now that must be taken with a grain of salt. Now, when you think of political parties in the United States throughout history mostly had just two parties. Most of the time, two. In Europe and a lot of other countries, they'll have several parties. In this time, Germany had 9 major parties, and to get anything done, the party that has the most votes usually only has about 30% of the votes, and that's a plurality, and they have to govern by getting a coalition going, getting other parties that might agree with them and forming a coalition. But Hitler never had a majority of votes. Nevertheless, he was able to, as the leader of the most powerful political party in Germany, he was able to become very powerful in Germany. Then he went to Germany's president, von Hindenburg, and von Hindenburg was probably at this time suffering what we today would call Alzheimer's. In those days, they called it old age dementia, or old age feeble-mindedness, old age senility. But Hitler went into President Hindenburg and persuaded Hindenburg to make him the chancellor. Then once he was chancellor, Hitler dispensed with the office of president. Then he went to the German Congress and persuaded the German Congress, otherwise known as the Reichstag, to give him total powers. In other words, pass a law that in effect said that Hitler was to be able to rule the country by decree and basically do anything he wanted. How did he do it? There was a book written about 40 years or so ago called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which I happened to read when I was in school, in junior high school. And they asked that question over again, how did he do it? There have been many a person study how was Hitler able to pull it off. And a lot of persons have said that the only thing they can figure is that the German people were taught from the time they were young, you must obey authority. Catholic Germans and Protestant Germans alike were told you must obey your father, you must obey your commanding officer. And German soldiers were told whatever you do, you always obey your commanding officer. And German soldiers who protested their commanding officer much too often found themselves lined up in front of a firing squad and shot dead. This even happened to generals in the German army. it was said that the German soldier had no lack of courage when facing the enemy, but when facing his superior, he was nothing but jelly, nothing but water in the hands of the superior officer. He simply did not dare say a word except, yes, sir, sure, sir, indeed, sir, yes, sir. Therefore, when Hitler got the authority, there was no one who would stand up to him. Again, many books have been written. One of them that was given to me by my brother-in-law that I happened to read and then reread just last year said that the people who should have stood up to him, what happened was this person saying, now I should stand up to him, but I just don't feel like losing my life and the life of my family. I won't stand up to him, but over there, the next group, they will. Well, that group didn't stand up to him either. To make a long story short, no one stood up to him. And this author puts it this way, the book is Defying Hitler, by the way, Sebastian Haffner by name, don't worry about the name, but he said, it was like a revolution, but it was a revolution unlike any other in history. In most revolutions you have one group, the established group, standing there to oppose, and the other group comes in with a lot of courage, and there's a big fight going. He said this group, they had the established group, but they just simply laid down and played dead and rolled over and did nothing. And Hitler and his Nazis were able to come in and without a whole lot of opposition. Now, there were a few opposition people who opposed. They wound up being carried off to concentration camps, wound up disappearing, oftentimes wound up dead. And can you imagine our president getting a congressman out and flogging with a whip? This is what happened to a lot of the members of the Reichstag who opposed Hitler. They were beaten into the line until they were beaten enough to where they would finally yield. Nobody would stand up to him. Now, folk, this is something I don't recall having said to another class. I'm going to say to this one. There was a person one time who, in the mid-1920s, when Hitler did not have his rise to power yet, who happened to meet Adolf Hitler. And he said that when he met Hitler, he looked into his eyes. And he said, I knew it when I looked into his eyes. This man is virtually unstoppable. This man is going to rise to the top. His eyes were conveyed a really fierce demeanor to him. I don't know how to explain it. I mean, you know, I have met some people like that. Just looking at him, you are intimidated into submission, to where even the generals of the army would not stand up to him. The Congress, the German would not stand up to him. When he just started to take over, everything fell in front of him. Again, how did he do it? We may never know. Okay. Anyway, 1933, Hitler is fully established in power. He had smashed the parliamentary state. Now he felt like he could really turn on and develop the total state that was pure Aryan. He began his persecution of Jews, and he persecuted Jews so hard that many young Jews saw they had no chance and committed suicide. Now, Albert Einstein, who was living in Germany at the time, was able to get out because of his famous name. Einstein was a Jew. Einstein left. When I was at Lockheed, I talked to a man who had been able to get out. He's now deceased, a man named Herb Rubel. But he said, my mother got rid of me the way a cat gets rid of a kid. My mother had 7 children. My father was already deceased. She got rid of the oldest one first. And the only reason he got out of Germany was his great-great-grandfather moved to Alabama. So he had relatives here. President Roosevelt would allow persons to come over here who had relatives. Since he had relatives, he got out. But then his mother, after getting rid of all 7 of her children, one at a time, to the United States, she was taken to a concentration camp and died there. I will have more to say about the Holocaust later. Again, folk, I've heard a lot of stories about what life was like in Nazi Germany during Hitler's rule. I heard one about a bunch of people meeting in a church service. And they would get in a church service, and when they hear the train coming, you could hear the rumble of the train in the distance, they would all start, the pianist would start playing a piano and all start singing loud music, really loud, until the train went by. Now, why do they play the music and start singing when the train went by? They didn't want to pay any attention to the screams that were coming from the train of people who were going, that people who knew they were going to death, and people were hollering, save us, help us. They just simply drowned it all out. And as soon as the train went by, they went back and resumed their normal mode of worship. I mean, folks, can anybody imagine a scenario like this? I mean, where that you knew your neighbors are disappearing, going off to their death, but well, it won't happen to me. Now, here's the way one person put it. And afterwards, since he didn't have a tape recorder record his speech, even he couldn't tell later how I said it, but it went something like this. He said, here's what it was like in Nazi Germany. First, he said, first they came after the Jews. I was not a Jew. I did not protest. Next, they came after the communists. I was not a communist. I did not protest. Next, they came after the trade unionists. I was not a trade unionist. I did not protest. Then they came after the Masons. Well, being a Catholic, I was not a Mason. I did not protest. Next, they came after the Gypsies. Well, I was not a Gypsy. I did not protest. Next, they came after me. And nobody protested. All right. Again, it was a scenario of fear. If you want to drop it over, you can drop it. A scenario of fear, of dread, and of a feeling of ominous that something bad is wrong. Now, to understand something too about the mindset of the German people, we have to understand they had not lived in democracy, but except for a few years. They had lived under a totalitarian state where there had been the Kaiser who ruled them before, and they were used to totalitarianism, and also democracy appeared to them to be decadent, even as it did to Hitler. But also, what had happened to them during World War I? They had been fed the propaganda that you're winning the war. They've been told for 4 years, you're winning, you're on the verge of winning. And it was true, no enemy troops had invaded Germany during the war. And it was true that the Russians had pulled out of the war and said, well, we defeated the Russians, and this was largely true. And now we're going to put all our troops on the Western Front now, and we're about to win. And they were told this till they finally told one day, their Kaiser has abdicated, we've surrendered. And this was a shock and a shock. I mean, if they had been told all along they were losing or about to lose, but I mean, you tell people they're winning, and all of a quick, sudden, it's like, oh, they go to bed thinking they're winning, and the war's about over. They get up the next morning. Again, this put a shock on them, and it's somewhat unimaginable. And again, it was a terrible blow to them. And this may have had something to do with a feeling of low self-esteem. Then Hitler came along, and he gave them he gave them hope. He gave them a feeling of, hey, you're better than everybody else. We're going to get out of this.